Hi, I'm Chloe. I'd like to thank HashiTalks Build for the opportunity to speak today. Should We Build It is a response and update to a talk I gave almost exactly 3 years ago and is the product of learning, reflection, and iteration on my part. I'm writing this at a strange time in the world where it occasionally feels difficult to acknowledge that our previous approaches, such as prioritizing profit or increasing user engagement at the expense of ethics, has contributed to a wide variety of disastrous consequences. That those consequences have been mostly unintentional makes this talk feel even more crucial to me. I hope this talk can be a continuation of the conversation about how to engage in ethical development at a time where, more than ever, that requires a willingness to change in the face of new information and a commitment to long-term good over short-term gain. What follows is a collection of my thoughts on the topic. Chapter 1, Empathy, Ethics, and Hard Problems. There's a saying, technology is neutral. It's complete garbage. Technology isn't neutral because it's made by real people. Technology is better considered impartial in the sense that it cannot make conceptual exceptions to its underlying functionality and effects. No matter the best intentions of its creators, technology can only exhibit the traits encoded in it. Its creators must supply any empathy built into the system through their own guiding principles, design choices, and final implementations. As I was working on this talk, I read a tweet thread about a woman whose Nigerian mother couldn't communicate with her smart home devices because they couldn't understand her accent. Voice recognition has one set of recognized sounds for any given set of words, and if the way you speak isn't in its dictionary, it can't understand you. Like an automatic faucet that can't recognize Black users whose skin is too dark, these devices demonstrate the gap between their creators and their end users. The impact of or effect of the technology was considered without complete context about the people whose lives it would touch. This tweet thread caused me to think about how many people I know who've had a hand in the design and implementation of something they were proud of, and stories of when those features or creations had to be updated or fixed due to a similar gap in their creation. About the conversations I've had with friends where we talked about what we were making and around the edges of it, trying to feel out whether we were really comfortable with what we were doing. Ethical development is a huge subject, and it gets pushed off too often as a hard problem. Rather than tackling ethics as an upfront investment of time, effort, and yes, money, it's treated as something that can be addressed if it becomes a problem later. In community projects and personal projects, it's often shoved aside with the argument, but we don't have the resources to invest in that. In some ways, human history is a story of technology. Every major change in the way we live has been brought on by technology. Access to technology can be a great equalizer. Many of the world's communities have limited ability to access or influence technology and instead find themselves on the negative side of the equation. From victory in war to success in surviving natural disaster, who is able to survive and rebuild and who is not is often a matter of technology and wealth. Approaching this fact with empathy and humility, I find myself returning to the idea again and again that in some small part, my work in technology contributes to the possibility for human advancement. And because of that, I think about what my obligations are as an engineer and a creator, how to understand the impact of my work on a community or system. Chapter 2, This talk isn't. This talk isn't all the answers. Ethics is the kind of thing people make a career of studying. Trying to distill the totality of moral philosophy down to a little over 20 minutes would be impossible. This talk isn't a specific ethical code. It assumes we share broad, similar community goals, creating work that is uplifting, beneficial, or generally constructive, likewise avoiding work which is destructive or causes harm. This also won't define good technology and bad technology, because the real ethical questions are almost never, am I about to clone a T-Rex that will try to eat the guests at my super illegal animal zoo? I wish ethical questions in technology were ever that simple and straightforward. If we were always facing villains with volcano layers, we would never have to have this conversation. The real ethical questions are about whether small decisions will have great impacts and whether our principles can tolerate compromises that we're looking at making. Or, more succinctly, if we get to inventing Skynet, we've already lost. Chapter 3, Hindsight is 2020. It is my judgment in these things that when you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you have had your technical success. J. Robert Oppenheimer, father of the atom bomb. In 1954, Oppenheimer spoke these words while discussing the creation of the atom bomb, an invention he contributed to and would begin working to see abolished shortly after it was completed. The history of technology is full of similar stories, both factual and fictional. The story that haunts me most is that of Asa Raskin, the inventor of infinite scroll. Raskin's regret is that something he created in naive idealism has ultimately become an agent of harm. He estimates infinite scroll wastes a truly mind-boggling number of hours every day. This technology is now considered so integral to how our apps work that we get angry if it glitches. As technologists, we have the awe-inspiring responsibility of being the people who are building the social and societal infrastructure of the future. Technological history is also the story of constant iterative change, innovation emerging not with a lightning bolt from the sky, but with an aha as some change or shift or new perspective leads to building on the past. Call it remix theory or recombinatorics, iteration accelerates creation. Over time, simple systems become more and more complex, enabling us to do things that once seemed impossible. But iteration also has the tendency to magnify flaws and complexity the tendency to hide them. The risks introduced are often highly technical, requiring experts even within the subset of people who are technologists. Chapter 4, Butterflies and Hurricanes. And so we return to the heart of this framework. Every technical decision we make has material consequences, whether physical or social. From what frameworks and languages we use to what we design and build, the results of our decisions impact people we'll never meet in ways we still don't grasp. Technology has changed the world so quickly in the last century that it only superficially resembles the world of 200 years ago. But just as society shapes technology shapes society. What technology makes frictionless will become standard. For a hyperspeed microcosm example, in roughly a decade, self-check has become standard in grocery stores across the country. And in less than that, Apple Pay has become a standard payment option, not just in large cities, but in small towns. The butterfly effect is a pop science just so story that is ultimately used to either promote or refute the idea that a complex system can be reduced to a perfectly predictive model given enough data. A butterfly flaps its wings in Asia, a hurricane touches down in the southeastern United States. But if the goal is to prevent hurricanes from causing damage and injury, measuring butterfly wings is the wrong way to go about it. Butterflies are not the instigators of hurricanes. Complex systems like weather or technology can't be pragmatically considered in that way. If all of our decisions have material consequences, but it's impossible to treat them as naive assumptions or formulaic heuristics, the framework for ethical development has to rethink the problem entirely. I offer 5 tenets: prioritize ethics, diversify perspectives, reduce harm, iterate towards better, just say no. These are designed to change the focus of the question. Not should it be built, but should we build it? Chapter 5, prioritize ethics. Voltaire declares words to the Unity congregation in Philadelphia may have been composed in 1890, but 121 years later, they are just as true. You will never get right until you start right. Development doesn't start in a design document or a Git repository. It doesn't start in architecture diagrams or deployments. Development starts when we begin thinking about how to solve a problem. The way we frame the question to ourselves and the aspects of it we decide to care about will be the first principles from which the technology emerges. Later developments will have to be grafted to this structure, which makes changing these underlying principles difficult. Meanwhile, having a good intent and a big heart aren't enough to ensure that we're building ethically. Ethical development requires a commitment to prioritizing alignment with our ethics above other concerns, such as profit, speed of development, or innovation. Everything we create should be asked the question, does building this contribute to a world in alignment with my principles? This question is a powerful reframing of the concept of ethical development. It moves us, technologists, from trying to interrogate whether a technology is good or bad to thinking about the technology in the context of a larger system. When we ask if we're in alignment with our principles, we acknowledge our greatest ethical guide, our conscience, and trust it to guide us. Rather than saying technology is neutral, a cliche which isn't really true, we might say more technology is indifferent. Our creations will not care about anything that isn't built into them. And so our commitment to ethical development as a first principle means returning over and over to this question. Chapter 6, Diversify Perspectives. I've watched technology change the world immensely in my life. From a childhood where my family still had a rotary phone because it worked perfectly well, to carrying a futuristic iPad around like a notebook for my idle thoughts. And I've watched the world around me expand as fast as technology could enable it. From my first dial-up BBSs as a teenager to watching international conferences and community days live over the internet in a few decades. It is a misspent youth on the early internet I can credit with my love of technology and my eventual career. I am fortunate to know technologists from all over the globe, from dozens of countries. I think I'm beyond lucky to live in a time where I get to be part of a global community like that. But it has also made me conscious of how often I still make assumptions about technology, access, and knowledge that assume my frame of reference is the default. In a previous job, I worked with journalists, and thinking through technological safety in foreign countries was an entire education on the subject, one I got very quickly. Every new technology changes the world, and the system is now much wider than our individual frames of reference. In order to fully understand how our work will impact the world, we have to fill in the gaps in our awareness and understanding of its effects and consequences. We can't do it by ourselves or with people who share our gaps. We need to see who isn't in the room and make an extra effort to include them. We must make the choice to build our work in teams based on shared goals and principles rather than shared perspective or proximity. Technology that is created in monoculture tends to be brittle, difficult to change, and insecure. Diverse perspectives, however, tend to be more dynamic in thinking. This allows them to build things which are more resilient and creative. While it's easy to say diversify perspectives, the truth is that it can be hard. Technology is creative, and it's difficult to receive feedback on our creations that feels critical. Gathering feedback from people who aren't already in the room also requires humility and proactive cultivation of a community to get feedback from. When pursuing ethical development, it is our responsibility to be fully informed about the potential risks of our creations and their effects in order to determine if they truly contribute to a world in alignment with our goals. When we diversify the perspectives in our development processes, seeking feedback from a variety of voices, we ensure we are not missing weaknesses, flaws, or risks in the technology we create. Chapter 7, Reduce Harm. A woman and lawyer I very much respect once said to me, software engineering is not a profession. She's an incredibly smart person and not generally in the habit of having what I think of as spicy takes. So I asked for an explanation, wanting to learn me a thing. She unpacked for me the idea that professions require some sort of professional certification that you are qualified to do the thing, whatever that thing may be. Professions have professional codes, which their members follow, such as legal ethics for the bar or medical ethics for doctors. She's right by that measure. Software engineering isn't quite a profession, but having a commonly held professional code of ethics seems like a fairly solid idea. And every professional code of ethics in the world starts with some sort of harm reduction tenet. From the oft-quoted but not quite right, first do no harm of the Hippocratic Oath, to the actual words of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, whose code begins with a tenet reading, hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, to strive to comply with ethical design and sustainable development practices, and to disclose promptly factors that might endanger the public or the environment. Because I was torn, I'll also mention the Association for Computing Machinery's first and second general ethical principles, which paraphrased, set the expectation that member computing professionals will contribute to human well-being, acknowledge that all human beings are stakeholders in technology, and avoid harm. These are the baseline ethics all members are expected to share. For what it's worth, that one's a pretty neat document, and if you're interested in this sort of thing, you might want to give it a read. The practice of harm reduction requires asking not just how our designs are vulnerable, but how they can be misused or made harmful. It requires evaluating whether the impact of our decisions will be in alignment with our principles. And then it requires committing to building in a way that minimizes the negative impact of our creations. Chapter 8, iterate towards better. One of my favorite sayings about sculpting is that to make a sculpture, you simply take a block of marble and chip away everything that isn't the sculpture. Improving our work is a lot like that. The first thing we create, the design, the proof of concept, the first draft code, all of it will eventually have pieces chipped away or changed as it is used, and as we think of features to add or ways to improve functionality. When considering the social and physical impacts of our work, we must think in the same way. What was good enough yesterday must remain open to review and refinement so that when ethical debt is found or new risk is uncovered, we are ready to iterate it towards a better state, to change it towards a greater alignment with our principles. Sometimes this is easy. In some situations, the solution is completely technical, something like adding encryption, changing a logging function to mask sensitive data you don't need to collect. Frequently, it's more challenging and becomes another exercise in accountability and humility if we're lucky. But iteration is the giant job we signed up for, and improving the ethical stance of our creations is as important as improving their security stance or accessibility. In many cases, as I've said before, it's the same thing. When new information or context reveals to us that our previous decisions are no longer enough, ethical development requires us to seek ways to improve it or change it. Should we build it does not end at release. As long as we are responsible for the things we create, we must remain accountable for them too. Chapter 9, just say no. As a kid, my parents had some rules they shared every time I left the house. The usual be home before dark type stuff. But they always ended with don't take any offers you can't refuse or join any clubs you can't get out of on your own 2 feet. While I'm pretty sure that rule originally had more to do with a cinephile father's love for mafia movies than anything else, it's advice I've always held on to as a reminder that there are times one must say no. As technologists, we are frequently sought after. We're considered experts. In many places, we're seen as somewhat special, the type of people that hear, I could never learn to do that. In our projects, whether professional or personal, we're seen as the last word, the person who knows what can be done and how to do it. And that is why when we are asked to do that which we cannot ethically do, we must say no. In personal projects, by which I only mean those we are not being paid for, saying no is often more straightforward than in professional projects. However, I only mean that deciding not to build something will probably come with social consequences rather than material ones. In our professional lives, when we are confronted with objecting, we may be risking much more. Our livelihoods, our health insurance, in some cases, our visas or working arrangements that provide accommodation for our needs and would be hard to replicate with another employer. These risks are real, but if we cannot build in alignment with the principles of harm reduction and contributing to a world in alignment with our principles, they are also required. This is why ethics are truly a hard problem, not because we don't know what's right, but because we know what doing the right thing can cost. Chapter 10, Avoiding Raptors in the Suburbs. My favorite morality tale about technology and ethics is Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. While the movie version is more commonly known, in the book, the character of Ian Malcolm has even more room to make cynical, if accurate, observations. His quote, cut down for film digestibility, was originally, "Scientists are actually preoccupied with accomplishment, so they are focused on whether they can do something. They never stop to ask if they should do something." His echo of Oppenheimer's words is assumedly intentional and meant to be as precautionary as their predecessors. The idea of cloning murderous dinosaurs who will someday escape their dangerous electrified cages and rampage across an island so you can fill a theme park with them seems laughably absurd when delivered in a single sentence. But Tiger King, one of the most popular pieces of media online for a while last year, was a documentary about an exotic animal zoos full of large cats kept by private owners. Rampaging Dino Theme Park is just a version of the truth that's exciting for fiction, so hopefully we'll pay attention. When I'm asked about my getting into tech story, I often say it was about video games, and in a way, this is true. But it's not the complete truth. The whole truth is I grew up an optimistic kid with their eyes on a Star Trek future, one where problems like cancer, world hunger, violence would be tackled by the best available minds, rather than being limited by corporate NDAs and fear of competition. I learned my first ethics from science fiction, a never-ending parade of the ways unethical behavior leads to disaster, not just for a handful of people, but for the whole human race. I've been a hacker since my first Commodore 64, but in the last 5 years, I've become a professional engineer and now manager. I've watched a move fast and break things ethos war with a be kind and solve problems one. It seems ironic to me that being disruptive is something praised in tech when a disruption is usually a negative event and one we hope to avoid. I mention this because I think how we talk about it matters. And if we're going to be successful with an ethical development framework, we have to use one that keeps us looking in the right direction. Rather than disruption, ethical development calls for us to look for innovation, change that creates or improves. If human history is the story of technology, then we, technologists today, are writing history with our decisions. The things we build and the communities we build around them deserve to be more than afterthoughts or compliance checklists. The costs of waiting to consider ethical risks until change is inevitable include ecological damage, political unrest, and human harm. As technologists, we have immense power. We are still so very rare in the world, and what we build matters. Our work touches the lives of strangers no matter what we do, and we may never be able to truly see the impact of it. Our ability to predict the future, and anyone who says otherwise is overconfident, but we owe it to that future to make the best choices we can now in terms of minimizing harm and destruction. So, as we draw to a close, I've appreciated your time today. As I've mentioned before, I think about this a lot, and I hope we as a community continue the conversation around ethical development and accountability. We can't rely on our best intentions to save us, but we can use them to guide us to building better things. Thank you.